My fiancée said I was too boring to spend her prime with. The next day, I drained our joint account and sent her dad the receipts. I used to believe that my life with Camille was moving towards something solid, something permanent. We'd been together for 3 years, and during that time, I built everything around the assumption that she and I were a team. I worked hard, budgeted carefully, and planned for the future, because that was how I thought love and responsibility worked. She had her quirks, expensive tastes, flashes of impatience, the kind of stubbornness that could turn a small disagreement into a silent war, but I chalked it up to personality differences. Nobody's perfect, right? It wasn't until that one night, in the middle of what was supposed to be a normal dinner with friends, that I realized how far off my vision of our relationship was from hers. We'd been invited to a casual get-together at one of her friends' apartments. Wine, delivery food, and the kind of shallow gossip that fills the silence in groups of people who don't really have much in common. I didn't say much. I never did in those circles. They weren't my friends, they were hers. I wasn't the type to jump into conversations about designer handbags or which gym instructor had the best abs. I stayed polite, attentive, but quiet. At some point, I excused myself to the balcony, pretending to take a phone call. It was stifling inside, and the laughter felt sharp, directed at something invisible. I leaned against the railing, staring at the traffic below, and then I heard it. Through the cracked sliding door, Camille's voice carried out, loud enough for me to catch every word. She wasn't whispering. She was practically performing for her audience. He's just too boring to spend my prime years with. I mean, look at him. He thinks paying bills on time is exciting. He thinks buying groceries together is romance. I don't want to wake up one day and realize I wasted my 20s being someone's mother instead of his girlfriend. The room erupted in laughter. Someone asked if she was serious. She said she was testing the waters, seeing how long she could drag things out before finding something better. I froze. It wasn't just the insult. It wasn't just the dismissal of everything I thought we were building. It was the casual way she said it, as if my life, my commitment, and my love were items on a clearance rack she was tired of browsing. I stayed outside until the conversation shifted, then walked back in with a straight face. I didn't confront her. Not there, not then. I played the part, nodded at jokes, even helped clean up before we left. She didn't notice a thing. On the ride home, she scrolled through her phone, laughing at some meme. She didn't even look at me. That night, lying next to her in bed, I stared at the ceiling while her breathing slowed into sleep. My chest felt hollow, but in that hollow space, something else grew, cold clarity. Confronting her directly would do nothing. She had already made her judgment of me. She thought I was too boring, too predictable, too safe. What she didn't know was that predictability has its uses. Patterns can be broken. Quiet men can act loudly when the time comes. The next morning, she kissed me absent-mindedly before heading out to brunch with the same group of friends. She didn't sense a shift in me because I didn't let it show. I waited until I heard the door click shut, then I got up and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. We had a joint account. It wasn't everything. We each had our own separate accounts as well, but this one was the main reservoir we used for bills, vacations, future plans. Over the years, I had deposited the majority of what sat there, because Camille's spending habits rarely allowed her to contribute equally. I told myself I didn't mind. I wanted us to have security, a cushion. Now, staring at the balance, I felt nothing but disgust. I transferred the money out. All of it. Not to hide it, not to gamble with it, but to reclaim what had been mine in the first place. I shifted it into my personal savings account, the one only I controlled. When the transaction completed, the joint account balance read $34.19. Enough for a takeout order. Enough to make her wonder, but not enough to give her any cushion when she reached for it next. I printed every transaction receipt, every deposit, every contribution I had made. Then I organized them into a neat stack, slipped them into an envelope, and wrote a single name on it. Gerald. Gerald was Camille's father. He was a serious man, retired from a long career in finance, who had always looked at me with suspicion, as though wondering if I could ever measure up to his standards. He wasn't cruel, but he was sharp-eyed, the kind of father who demanded accountability from everyone, including his own daughter. Camille, however, had always taken advantage of his reluctant generosity. Whenever she overspent or dug herself into a financial hole, she'd run back to him with tears and excuses, and most of the time, he'd bail her out. But lately, I'd sensed that his patience was running thin. I sealed the envelope and drove it to his house. He was surprised to see me, but not hostile. I handed him the envelope, told him to read it, and that it contained proof of where his daughter's stability had been coming from. I didn't linger. I didn't explain. I just told him to call me if he had questions, then left. By the time I got home, Camille was already back. She was pacing the living room, phone in hand, swearing under her breath. She didn't look up at me right away, too consumed by whatever text thread she was firing off. When she finally noticed me, her face twisted into fury. "What happened to the account?" she snapped. "It's empty. Did you forget to pay something? Did you screw up?" I shrugged, keeping my tone flat. "I moved my money. That's all." Her mouth fell open, then closed again. She sputtered, half-formed accusations spilling out. Theft, betrayal, control freak. I let her words bounce off me, because none of them mattered anymore. She stormed into the bedroom, slamming drawers, muttering about calling her dad. I sat on the couch, listening. A minute later, her voice dropped into a panicked whine. She was on the phone, and it was obvious he wasn't reacting the way she expected. When she returned, her face was pale. She didn't yell again. She didn't even look at me. She just grabbed her keys and left without another word. That was the first crack in the foundation of the image she had built of herself. The version of Camille who thought she could mock me openly, drain my efforts, and still control the narrative. She hadn't realized that I could play quietly, strike quickly, and leave her scrambling. But that was only the beginning. The words she spoke on that balcony had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. What came next would dismantle not just her view of me, but the entire shield of privilege she thought would protect her forever. And the irony was perfect. She thought I was boring. She thought I was predictable. She thought I would always sit quietly while she planned her better future. She had no idea that the dullest blade in the drawer can still cut deep if you never see it coming. The silence that followed Camille's sudden departure from our apartment that day was heavier than anything I had experienced in our relationship. For years, the background noise of her voice, complaints, demands, bursts of laughter, had filled every corner of our shared space. Now, the apartment was still. It felt like the pause before a storm. I didn't wait for her to return. Instead, I cleaned the kitchen, poured myself a drink, and let the stillness seep into me. My phone buzzed once that evening. It was a message from Gerald. He asked if we could meet the next morning at his house. Nothing more, nothing less. When I arrived, Gerald was waiting in his study, the envelope I had given him resting open on the desk. The papers were spread neatly, every receipt, every record lined up with the precision of a man who had spent his life balancing numbers and dissecting financial statements. He gestured for me to sit, but didn't immediately speak. His silence was a test, one he expected me to squirm under. Instead, I leaned back in the chair and let him take his time. Finally, he told me he had always suspected Camille was careless, but he hadn't realized the extent of her recklessness. He said he had noticed her lifestyle escalating beyond her means, the shopping trips, the constant nights out, the vacations she framed as girls' trips that never quite added up. He had assumed I was either blind to it or enabling it. Now, staring at the records, he realized I had been the one holding everything together. It wasn't a compliment. Gerald didn't deal in compliments. But there was a shift in his tone, a grudging respect. He said Camille had called him after discovering the account was empty, ranting about betrayal and theft. He had let her scream, then calmly explained that the money in question was mine, not hers. He told me she hung up on him before he could finish the sentence. For Gerald, this wasn't just about money. It was about accountability. He had raised her with every advantage, but he had never been able to instill discipline. He said that now, she would learn the lesson the hard way, because he was finished cushioning her falls. When I left his house that day, I realized something important. I wasn't the only one who had grown tired of Camille's games. The next week unfolded like a slow unraveling of her carefully maintained image. Camille came home that evening after our account debacle, her face red with anger and embarrassment. She demanded to know how I could humiliate her like that in front of her father. I didn't respond. Silence, I discovered, was more powerful than shouting. It left her with nothing to push against. She stormed around the apartment, slammed doors, made phone calls. Friends started showing up, drawn by the drama. They sat on our couch, listening as she painted herself as the victim of an over-controlling fiancé who had stolen from her. Some nodded sympathetically, but others exchanged glances. People had noticed her behavior before, the extravagant purchases, the entitled demands. Now, with Gerald refusing to side with her, the cracks were too wide to ignore. By the end of that week, Camille's father had frozen the credit cards he still controlled. She tried to use one at a boutique and nearly collapsed when it was declined. Word spread fast in her circle. For a woman who built her identity on appearances and luxury, nothing could have cut deeper. The fallout seeped into social gatherings. At one dinner, she showed up late, disheveled, and tried to dominate the conversation with tales of how heartless I had been. But someone asked a quiet question about the money she had been spending on trips. Another mentioned they had seen her with a man at a resort that she had claimed was a girl's only getaway. The room grew colder, her charm faltered, and she left before dessert. Meanwhile, I focused on my work. I picked up extra hours, made quiet progress, and avoided her whenever I could. At home, we moved like strangers passing in the hall. She would glare, mutter insults under her breath, and slam the bedroom door, but I didn't bite. The turning point came when Gerald invited me and Camille to his house together. He wanted to clear the air. Camille arrived first, still simmering with rage. I arrived 10 minutes later, and Gerald wasted no time. He laid out the receipts again, asked Camille to explain her spending patterns, and watched as she squirmed. She tried to claim they were mutual decisions, that I had agreed to every purchase. Gerald didn't raise his voice, but his eyes cut through her excuses. He told her that she had drained not only my contributions, but his patience as well. The conversation ended with a statement that stunned both of us. Gerald told Camille he was removing her from his will until she could demonstrate responsibility with her own life. He wasn't disowning her, but he was finished funding her bad habits. Camille's face went pale. She turned on me, accusing me of orchestrating the entire thing, of manipulating her father against her. Gerald silenced her with a look that made even me sit straighter. He told her she had nobody to blame but herself. After that day, Camille's anger curdled into desperation. She called friends constantly, trying to gather sympathy, but sympathy had limits. People were tired of listening. Some began avoiding her. She started staying out later, coming home at odd hours, sometimes not at all. When she did return, she would accuse me of making her life miserable, of ruining her future. I didn't respond. The more silent I remained, the more frantic she became. Her humiliation escalated in public ways. One afternoon, I heard from a colleague that Camille had shown up at a mutual acquaintance's party, loudly sobbing about how I had left her penniless. She threw around accusations of emotional cruelty, of control, but the audience was less receptive than she expected. People who once admired her confidence now saw cracks in the facade. She had overplayed her hand, and everyone could see it. What she didn't know was that Gerald had already taken another step. He reached out to me privately a few days later. He said he had hired someone to quietly look into Camille's finances and recent activities. What he found wasn't just irresponsible spending. It was betrayal. Gerald told me Camille had been withdrawing small amounts from her personal account, not to save or invest, but to fund weekends away with a man named Brent, a trainer she had met at her gym. They had been seeing each other for months, under the guise of wellness retreats and spa weekends. Hearing his words didn't sting the way I thought it would. The betrayal had already happened the night she mocked me on that balcony. This was just confirmation of what I had begun to suspect. The difference now was that she couldn't twist the narrative anymore. Her father knew. Soon, everyone else would too. Gerald asked me what I planned to do. I told him nothing. I didn't need to lift a finger. Camille's own actions were already dismantling her life, piece by piece. And that was exactly what happened. By the end of that month, Camille was isolated. Friends kept their distance. Her credit cards were frozen. Her father's support had dried up. Even Brent, the man she had sacrificed her stability for, was starting to show signs of pulling away. He liked her lifestyle, not her problems. She came home one evening, her makeup streaked, her hair tangled, and collapsed onto the couch. She didn't even look at me. She just sat there in silence, staring at the floor. For the first time, I saw not the woman who mocked me, but the hollow shell left behind by her own arrogance. I didn't feel pity. I felt the weight of inevitability. The storm she had laughed her way into was now circling her, and there was no umbrella big enough to keep her dry. Camille had always relied on charm. When charm failed, she pivoted to victimhood. If victimhood didn't work, she resorted to rage. Each stage of that cycle had kept her afloat for years, helping her slip out of consequences, manipulating people into softening when they should have hardened. But now, with her father turning away, her friends drifting, and me refusing to rise to her provocations, Camille's old tactics started to mutate. She wasn't just trying to protect her reputation anymore. She was fighting for survival. The first strike came through whispers. A colleague of mine pulled me aside one morning and asked gently if everything was okay at home. He said he'd heard from someone that Camille had been confiding about my supposed volatility. According to her, I was controlling, financially abusive, even emotionally cruel. She painted a picture of a man who isolated her, cut off her support systems, and left her scrambling in fear. I almost laughed when I heard it, but the look on my colleague's face stopped me. He wasn't mocking. He was concerned. That was her strength. Camille knew how to tap into people's sympathies, how to choose just the right phrases to make herself sound like a victim of circumstances instead of the architect of her own collapse. Soon, similar ripples reached me from other corners. Friends who hadn't spoken to me in weeks suddenly sent awkward texts, half accusations wrapped in concern. A mutual acquaintance repeated to someone else that I had stolen everything from her, leaving her destitute. For a brief moment, I wondered if she might succeed. Rumors spread faster than truth. A carefully constructed sob story could undo years of quiet credibility. But what Camille hadn't calculated was the timing. People were already wary of her. They had seen her tantrums, her extravagant spending, her contradictions. Now, when she presented herself as a woman destroyed by a cruel fiancé, the story rang hollow. Those who had known me for years, friends, colleagues, even Gerald, dismissed her accusations outright. Still, she didn't stop. One evening, she showed up at a party thrown by a mutual friend. She arrived late, deliberately drawing attention, with mascara streaked down her cheeks and a bottle of wine clutched like a prop. The moment she stepped in, she launched into her performance, talking about betrayal, about how I had stolen her youth, about how she was being punished for wanting more from life. At first, people listened. Camille had always been good at controlling a room. But then one of the guests, a woman who had traveled with her on one of those girls' weekends, asked a pointed question: who had paid for the hotel? Another guest, who had heard whispers about her gym trainer Brent, raised an eyebrow and asked if she was really as alone as she claimed. The mask cracked. Camille's sobs turned shrill, her words desperate. She lashed out, accusing people of betrayal, insisting everyone was against her. By the end of the night, she stormed out, leaving behind nothing but the taste of awkward silence. The rumors didn't vanish overnight, but the shift was noticeable. People began talking about Camille not as a victim, but as a liability. The sympathy she had tried to harvest had curdled into disdain. At home, her desperation only deepened. She alternated between pleading and threatening. One night, she left a note on the counter, saying she regretted everything, that she wanted to start fresh, that she would change. The next day, she stormed into the living room, accusing me of ruining her life and hissing that I'd regret ever crossing her. But I had stopped reacting. The silence that once drove her mad now broke her down piece by piece. Without an audience, her theatrics were useless. Without my anger, her accusations had no stage. Meanwhile, Gerald's investigation into her finances uncovered more than either of us expected. He called me one evening, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. He had found receipts, messages, and records of Camille's weekends with Brent. They weren't subtle. Hotel reservations, spa treatments, dinners for two charged to cards she thought her father would never check. Gerald didn't just stop at finances. He tracked patterns, piecing together a timeline that stretched back months. Camille had been lying not only about her trips, but also about the money she claimed to save. She had even pawned jewelry he had given her, using the cash to fund Brent's lifestyle. Hearing Gerald's controlled fury was a revelation. For the first time, Camille's father saw her without illusions. She wasn't just reckless. She was manipulative, ungrateful, and deceitful. The confrontation came a few days later. Gerald summoned her to his house under the pretense of a family dinner. When she arrived, she found him waiting with a stack of evidence: printed bank statements, hotel bookings, and photos that left little room for denial. Neighbors later told me that her shouting echoed down the street. She tried to deny everything, then to twist the narrative, then finally to collapse into tears. But Gerald didn't yield. He told her that until she took responsibility for her choices, she would receive nothing more from him. No money, no inheritance, no bailouts. She came home that night in a rage. I heard her slamming doors, throwing clothes into a suitcase, muttering curses under her breath. I thought she might leave for good, but she didn't. The reality of being cut off had sunk in. She had nowhere else to go. Her relationship with Brent began to fracture soon after. Without the cushion of her father's money, she couldn't maintain the glamorous facade Brent had been drawn to. Their weekend getaways dwindled. Arguments replaced spa treatments. She still saw him, but now she returned home angrier, more desperate. The mask was slipping in every direction. Friends whispered about her downfall. Gerald refused her calls. Brent grew distant. And I remained calm, watching from a distance as her empire of appearances collapsed. The irony was inescapable. Camille had once sneered that I was too boring to spend her prime years with. But it wasn't boredom that ended her prime. It was her arrogance, her belief that she could play everyone without consequence. The final straw in part 3 came when she tried to corner me with a desperate plan. She returned one evening, her expression brittle, and said we needed to fix things. She wanted me to make a statement to friends and family that I had misunderstood her, that everything was fine, that the rumors about her were exaggerated. She claimed it was the only way to save her reputation. I looked at her, not with anger, but with a kind of detached pity. The woman who once thought she was untouchable was now begging me to rebuild her crumbling image. I didn't agree. I didn't even argue. I simply walked past her and shut the bedroom door behind me. That silence told her more than any words ever could. Camille was alone in her war now, and she was beginning to realize it. By the time autumn arrived, Camille's world had shrunk to fragments. Her once busy phone sat on the counter, buzzing only with bill reminders and the occasional message from a friend who hadn't yet cut ties. The invitations had dried up, the brunches disappeared, and the easy credit she had leaned on for years was nothing more than a memory. I noticed the small changes first. The shopping bags vanished from the hallway. The constant rotation of designer shoes slowed, replaced by the same pairs repeated each week. She started cutting corners with groceries, once a trivial concern, now suddenly urgent. These were not the choices of someone who still believed she was in control. They were the quiet admissions of a woman whose empire had crumbled beneath her. Brent was the next domino to fall. Their relationship had thrived when Camille could whisk him away to resorts, pay for dinners that stretched into the night, and surround him with the illusion of abundance. But when the stream dried up, so did his affection. I saw it in her face each time she returned from meeting him. First confusion, then panic, then rage. He stopped answering her calls as often, stopped appearing at her door with his cocky smile. One evening, she came home trembling, clutching her phone like it had betrayed her. She had finally confronted him about his distance, and Brent had told her the truth in the blunt way only selfish men can. He liked her for what she could provide, not for who she was. And now that she had nothing to give, he saw no reason to stay. She hurled the phone against the wall, the screen shattering into silence. 4 days after, Camille drifted around the apartment like a ghost. She didn't yell, didn't try to manipulate, didn't even speak much. It was as if the energy that once fueled her schemes had burned out completely. I expected her to lash out again, to blame me, but she didn't. Perhaps even she knew it was pointless now. Gerald, however, wasn't finished. A week later, he called me. His voice was colder than ever, stripped of any paternal softness. He told me that he had officially adjusted his estate plans. Camille was no longer listed as a beneficiary. Everything that would have gone to her was redirected to her younger cousin, someone who had demonstrated discipline and gratitude. He wanted me to know because he considered me the one who had exposed the truth, the one who had pulled away the curtain she had hidden behind. I asked him if he felt any regret. He said he felt only relief. When Camille discovered the change, the reaction was seismic. She confronted him in person, storming into his home, demanding explanations. He listened quietly, then handed her the revised paperwork. She left in tears, but this time, the door closed behind her without hesitation. She had lost not just his support, but his respect, a loss she had never considered possible until that moment. The unraveling didn't stop there. Camille tried to salvage her image by throwing herself into work, but her resume was thin, padded with vague roles and half-hearted attempts at self-employment. The glamorous lifestyle she had flaunted had never required real effort, and now, stripped of her father's money and Brent's attention, she faced the reality of an empty skill set. She applied for jobs, was rejected, applied again, and finally landed a low-paying position at a boutique. For someone who once lived for appearances, the humiliation of folding clothes for customers who recognized her was unbearable. I heard whispers through acquaintances, stories of her snapping at clients, of her tears in the stockroom. The woman who had mocked me for being boring now spent her days under fluorescent lights, wearing a name tag. And me? I didn't gloat. I focused on my work, on rebuilding my life quietly. The money I had reclaimed from our joint account sat safely in my own savings, no longer siphoned away for handbags or meaningless nights out. I spent more time with people who valued honesty, who didn't measure worth by how loudly you could perform in a room. Camille still lingered in the apartment for a while, though the silence between us was absolute. Eventually, she packed her belongings and left without ceremony. No apology, no speech, just the shuffle of suitcases and the slam of the door. I didn't stop her. I didn't even watch from the window. The receipts I had once sent to Gerald remained in his possession, a quiet monument to the moment the truth finally surfaced. They had been the first domino, the evidence that tore away the facade. And in some dark corner of my mind, I took satisfaction in knowing that those simple sheets of paper had accomplished what no argument ever could. Months passed. Life smoothed into something steady again. I heard about Camille occasionally, rumors of her struggles, her attempts to claw her way back into circles that had long since closed their doors to her. She was no longer a fixture at parties, no longer the woman people whispered about with envy. Instead, she had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly arrogance can rot the foundation of a life. The irony never left me. She had once sneered that I was too boring to spend her prime years with. But those prime years, the ones she thought she would use to elevate herself, had been spent burning bridges, betraying trust, and chasing illusions. By the time she realized what she had lost, it was gone forever. I didn't need to exact revenge beyond what had already unfolded. Karma had a way of completing the work on its own. The last time I saw Camille, months later, she was walking out of the boutique where she worked, her shoulders hunched, her face drawn with exhaustion. She didn't notice me, and I didn't make myself known. It was enough to see her like that, stripped of the arrogance that once defined her, reduced to an ordinary woman carrying the weight of her own choices. And I thought to myself, this was never about me being boring. It was about her being blind. She had gambled everything on appearances, and when the lights dimmed, she was left with nothing but the shadows of her own making. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.